Introducing Professor Kværne is both an easy and at the same time difficult task. It's easy because he's such a well-known expert in the field. Kværne has been professor in the history of religion at the University of Oslo from 1975 to 2007. And his research focus has been Tibetan religions, in particular the Bon tradition of Tibet, which is a tradition that traces itself back to pre-Buddhist times, but in present form shares many features with Tibetan Buddhism. In numerous publications, Kværne has covered new ground in this field and must be seen as one of the pioneers on Bon studies in the West, along with David Snellgrove, Samdhin Kame, Dan Martin, and others. Apart from specific field of interest, Kværne may almost appear like an embodiment of Tibetan studies itself. He has been part of the Tibetan studies community since the 1960s and 70s. He took part in the first ever international conference of young Tibetologists held in Zurich in 1977, and he was there when the International Association of Tibetan Studies was founded in Oxford in 1979. Kværne's academic field includes Indology, Buddhist, and Bon studies, as well as active interest in landscape painting. This diversity begins with his keen interest in a multiplicity of languages and literatures. He learned not only English, French, and Latin at school, and picked up Glaswegian during his time in Scotland, but as a student has also attended classes in Hindi, Pali, Prakrit, Sanskrit, Avestam, Classical Mongolian, and Samoan. His first monograph was on the spiritual songs in Old Bengali, Charya Giti. In addition, Kværne has also developed a keen interest in painting and art. One of his groundbreaking books on Bon tradition of Tibet approaches the topic not just through textual studies but also through visual culture of Bon as well as first-hand observation. The book is entitled Bon Religion in Tibet, Iconography of a Living Tradition. More recently, he has published an art history, including the singing songs of the Scottish Hart William MacTaggart, 1835 to 1910. On top of being a distinguished academic, Kværne is a humanist with a humanistic approach to seeing the other, the Tibetan situation and predicament, socially, culturally, and politically, and has been contributing to enhancing the human capital of Tibetans through various means. In 1963, when Kværne heard that a group of some 80 young Tibetan boys and girls had arrived in Denmark for education and training, he volunteered to go there and teach and help them. Later, Kværne was actively involved in receiving about 30 boys from Denmark to Oslo and continue their education. Another example is the exchange program set up by the Norwegian government in 1994, under which over 100 Tibetan scholars from Tibet have benefited with degree and research studies in various universities of Norway. And Professor Kværne has supervised many of them and equipped them with the skills of critical approach and open-mindedness in their research. Kværne has traveled to India for the first time in 1964, and since then he has been there more than 20 times, several times to Tibet, many times to Dolanji, the Bombo Tibetan settlement and the site of the Bombo monastery and Bombo community in exile. Kværne was a very close friend of the late 33rd Meri Tenzin Lungdo Tembe Nyima, the supreme spiritual head of Bon tradition, who passed away recently on September 14th. Their friendship started way back in 1964, when Kværne arrived in India as a young man of 19 to teach English to Tibetans at a school headed by Sangye Tenzin, who was then the Meri Tenzin, who was then known as Sangye Tenzin. Later, when the school closed down, Kværne invited Rinpoche to the University of Oslo for research and collaborative work, teaching between 1966 and 1968. Since then, Professor Kværne has blazed a trail in the field of Tibetology with focus on historical, textual, visual aspects of Bon and Buddhism. And this leads me directly to tonight's title of the lecture, Buddhism, Bon and Buddhism, Two Faces of the Same Coin. Please help me to give a warm welcome to Professor Kværne.
Well, thank you very much for all those kind words. Many, maybe not all, but many were definitely unmerited. So, yes, tonight's title was actually given to me by Tsering, but I couldn't come up with a better one. So there we are. Burn and Buddhism, two sides of the same coin. Those among you who are familiar with the Tibetan national epic, the Gesar epic, will no doubt have come across the expression black burn. King Gesar is, as you all know, of course, the martial hero who combats the forces of evil in all the realms surrounding his own kingdom of Ling. Among his enemies are burn priests, described as black, hence as evil and harmful. Burn would seem to be the very opposite of the teachings of Lord Buddha upheld by Gesar. At the other end of the scale, the head of the Burn religion, as you just mentioned, the 33rd Menri Chisin, whose seat was the Burn monastery at Dolanji near Solan in Himachal Pradesh, passed away in September this year. Soon after his death, the Jalwa Karmapa composed a eulogy in his honor, and I think it deserves to be read, not in full, but I'll read quite a bit of it. So the Jalwa Karmapa writes, "The supreme 33rd Jalwa Menri Chisin was a hero who defended the citadel of the ancestors of Tibet, the land of snow. He was the lord of the Yungdrung Burn teachings, protecting guardian of the Tibetan people in and outside their country. For a while his mind has slipped away into the perfection of the realm of Burn, a lamp that cleared the darkness from the land of snow, and this world too has taken rest. Now, as this noble being of great activity has revealed his last deed, his compassion and kindness are clearer, coming to mind more often than before. In particular, at this junction in time, when we are facing the question of how Tibet's people and environment will survive, this protector of Tibet devoted his whole being to supporting the country. Undergoing immeasurable difficulties, he restored the fortunes of the teachings and living beings. In his great kindness, he devoted his entire life to benefiting others, holding them more important than himself. He had no choice but to help them. I pray with all sincerity that the integrity of the bond between the Burn teaching and the Karma Kaji lineage be maintained, that the true nature of the Yungdrung Burn remain firm, and that all the profound intentions and wishes of this great Lord be perfectly and swiftly completed." From these and similar statements, one might think that what has happened is that yet another great Buddhist master has, as the Jalwa Karmapa put it, temporarily retired from the human sphere to be reborn at some later time to continue his compassionate activity. Those of you who have followed the rituals performed in the Burn monastery in connection with the passing away of the Menri Chisin, as posted on Facebook, for example, may have been struck by the evident close similarity to corresponding Buddhist rituals. In fact, the entire Burn monastic environment can hardly be distinguished from that of Buddhism. If this is so, then Burn and Buddhism surely are two sides of the same coin. But is that the whole story? No, it is not. I suggest that we need to look not only at similarities of ritual, meditation, and monastic institutions. Here there is indeed little to separate Burn and Buddhism. However, we also need to look at the foundational and historical narratives of Burn, for adherents of both religions, Burn and Buddhism, attach great importance to these narratives. By the term narrative, I mean stories with an agenda, defining their identity and the validity of their respective doctrines and teachings. Accordingly, we shall look at two narratives as found in the textual heritage of Burn, and I shall argue that these narratives are crucial to understand the difference between Burn and Buddhism. Before doing so, however, an important clarification is in order. I believe it is widely known that in the imperial period of Tibet's history, that is between the 7th and the 9th century Common Era, there were ritual specialists who were designated as burn priests. They were involved in the cult of the dead kings and ritual activities at the royal court, including healing and making prognostications. However, as for viable historical sources go, we know little beyond that, and we are likewise in the dark as to the meaning of the term burn itself. Recent anthropological fieldwork in the eastern Himalayas, especially as carried out by Professor Toni Huber from the Humboldt University in Berlin, over many years, indicates that elements of this ancient tradition have survived until today in certain isolated communities who migrated into eastern Bhutan and the Tawang area in Arunachal Pradesh, perhaps 1,000 years ago. However, the results of this research still await publication. Priests known as Bumpus are found in these areas and in other parts of the Himalayan region too, for example among the Tamang in Nepal, but I shall put all this to one side and will not be discussing Himalayan ethnography further tonight. However, thanks to research carried out in the 1960s by Professor David Snellgrove, who taught here at SOAS, and subsequently by Samten Karmi, who was also educated here, and Anne-Marie Blondeau in Paris, Henk Blazer, Dan Martin, and myself, to mention a few, it is well established that in the 10th century, if not earlier, a religious and cultural movement emerged in central Tibet which claimed to continue the religion and the traditions of the burn priests who had been active in Tibet until about 200 years earlier. Calling themselves Bumpus, in other words, adherents of Burn, they insisted that they were the true custodians of the authentic pre-Buddhist religions of Tibet, although, viewing this phenomenon from the outside, there is no doubt at all that it incorporated crucial elements of Buddhist doctrine and practice, as I've already pointed out. Burn, in this sense of a more or less organized religious movement, distinguishes itself from the Burn of the imperial period, whatever that may have been, in that its adherents call their faith Yungdrung Burn, everlasting Burn, a term unknown as far as I'm aware, but I'll be very happy to be corrected here, was not found earlier. So from now on, when I use the term Burn tonight, I refer specifically to Yungdrung Burn, and I shall refer to its adherents as Bumpus. This religious tradition is still flourishing inside Tibet as well as in the diaspora, including religious centers catering to Westerners. Having briefly sketched this historical context, I shall now return to the two crucial narratives of the Burn religion. The first regards the origin and the founder of Burn. The second regards the introduction, or rather the consolidation, of Buddhism during the reign of Trisong Detsen, as seen by later Bumpus. I shall not spend time on outlining the established Buddhist narrative, which emerged at the same time as Yungdrung Burn itself, as this narrative is so well known, beyond reminding you that according to the Buddhist narrative, the Tibetan emperors are the magical emanations of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and the founding of Samye Monastery and the activities of Guru Rinpoche were crucial in establishing Buddhism in the land of snow. In short, the introduction of Buddhism, promoted by supernatural emperors, was a divinely ordained process of civilizing the inhabitants of Tibet. Now, the narrative of the Bumpus represents a completely different view. Bumpus do not regard Shakyamuni as the teacher and supremely enlightened being of our world age. Burn, as the term eternal burn indicates, is regarded as universal and unchanging, just as the concept of the Buddha's Dharma in Buddhism. Burn has been taught throughout the ages, the Bumpus maintain, by a series of enlightened beings, and in our cosmic period, the teacher of Burn is Trungpa Shenrab, which, like Shakyamuni, is a title rather than a personal name. it may be translated as the teacher, supreme priest. He is also known as Shenrab Miwo, the great man Shenrab. While the latter term is in fact attested in sources from the imperial period, a tangible figure does not seem to be firmly attested before the 11th century in the form of the protagonist of a fully developed biography, a text known as the Dodu, literally the abridged account. Time does not allow us to go into details, so I would like to simply say that I accept the conclusion arrived at by Kelsang Norbu Gurung in his doctoral thesis obtained at the University of Leiden in 2011. Namely, that this biography, and by implication the later and more elaborate versions of it, is, I quote, is a compilation of stories from various earlier sources, both oral as well as written. However, apart from certain Buddhist elements, probably deriving from the Buddha biography Lalita Vistara, such as Trungpa Shenrab being born as a prince and engaging in the struggle with the Lord of Demons, the protagonist, Trungpa Shenrab, does not seem to be modelled on Shakyamuni at all. Thus, while Trungpa Shenrab travels to numerous countries to propagate Bön, he does so not after having renounced the world, but while he is still a monarch. The events causing his travels are usually the sudden illness of a king of some distant country or someone in the king's family, and Trungpa Shenrab, invited by emissaries to travel to that country, subsequently propagates Bön by means of healing rituals rather than sermons, in contrast to what is usually the case with Shakyamuni. Further, and again in contrast to Shakyamuni, but similarly to the narratives featuring Songtsen Gampo and Guru Rinpoche, Trungpa Shenrab has numerous wives hailing from various countries, and they and their offspring play an important role in assisting Trungpa Shenrab in the propagation of Bön. It might be tempting to conclude that since parallels are found with such well-known narratives as those of Songtsen Gampo and Padmasambhava, originating as they do in the same period as the earliest biographies of Trungpa Shenrab, that is, the 11th to 12th centuries, this would be a vindication of the criticism levelled at the Bonpo and especially their scriptures, namely that they are the work of blatant plagiarists. However, at least in the case of the Padmasambhava narrative, the opposite may well be true. One of the relatively late sources of the Padmasambhava narrative is the Lhadre Katang, the proclamation regarding gods and demons, dating from the 14th century. This text relates the master's dramatic entry into Tibet, opposed at every turn by the local gods and demons who attempt in vain to block his path by hurling rocks, creating snowstorms, and so on. In a close study of this text, Anne-Marie Blondeau has shown that it is in fact retelling with numerous internal contradictions of a similar sequence of events told in the Zermig, the medium-length version of Trungpa Shenrab's biography. In the Zermig, in all probability a 12th century work, hence considerably older than the Lhadre Katang, the Lord of Demons steals Trungpa Shenrab's horses and sets off to Kongpo, where he has his headquarters, with Trungpa Shenrab in hot pursuit. The demon tries in vain to block the teacher's path by the same means that are later retold in the Lhadre Katang, but the narrative is in this case far more coherent than the later Buddhist version. Not surprisingly, Trungpa Shenrab is able to retrieve his horses as well as foiling an attempt to kill him by offering him poisoned beer. While Shakyamuni can be historically attested as having spent his life on the plains of northern India, Bonpos maintain, referring to their own sacred scriptures, not only that Trungpa Shenrab lived thousands of years before Shakyamuni, but that the kingdom over which he was the monarch was located far from Tibet. This land, called Womul Lungring, usually understood to be to the west of Tibet cannot be identified in historical or geographical terms and may be compared to the mythical Shambhala of the Buddhist tradition. Although always regarded as actually existing in this world, Walmo Lungring gradually, like Shambhala, came to be viewed as being accessible only to individuals with special spiritual gifts and took on an entirely mythological character. Now, since Buddhism was not only a fact of life, but also the dominant religion in Tibet, by the time when Yungdrung Bön emerged in the 10th and 11th century, the Bonpo somehow had to get to terms with it. Their chief strategy in terms of narrative was to promote a myth according to which Shakyamuni was the emanation of the speech of Trungpa Shenrab. And he, Shakyamuni, was sent to the world to put an end to the evil practices of a demon who masqueraded as a teacher propagating Dharma. Che. The demon was successfully vanquished by Shakyamuni, but later, as we shall see in a moment, similar evil practices were once again propagated, this time by Padmasambhava, who eventually was able to convert the king, Trisong Detsen, to his own nefarious practices. Now this brings us to the second key narrative of Bön, namely an exposition of the underlying reason why King Trisong Detsen became instrumental in consolidating Buddhism and making it his preferred religion. Stated in the briefest possible terms, according to this narrative, in former lives there were 3 beggars in India who, or possibly in Nepal, who uttered a solemn prayer that they might be reborn in such a way that they would make Buddhism flourish in Tibet. Accordingly, they were reborn as Trisong Detsen, Padmasambhava, and Shantarakshita. In due course, Trisong Detsen invited the 2 Indian masters to Tibet and started to practice Dharma. In spite of the pleadings of several ministers to continue to honor his ancestral gods. The king's motivation, according to the Bön narrative, is worth noting. He said, according to the Bön narrative, "The king of India is said to have attained 1,000 years because he practiced this doctrine. I require it in order to likewise prolong my life. Even if I die, I do not require the funeral rites according to Bön, for it is said that by uttering a single prayer one is reborn as a god, so now I shall practice Dharma." In other words, neither the pragmatic needs arising from ruling a vast empire, nor the admirable ethics or philosophy of Buddhism, but a personal wish to prolong his own life lay at the bottom of his decision. The narrative continues to relate how, after a long drawn-out struggle, of which we cannot go into the details here, Buddhism finally prevailed, and the priests of Bön, who for so many generations had enjoyed royal favor, and through their sacred rites, according to Bön, had ensured the prosperity of Tibet and the health of its inhabitants, were banished from the realm. As one text puts it, the priests went to uninhabited places among slate mountains and snow peaks, or flew up and disappeared into the sky. The result was, not surprisingly from the Bön point of view, that the royal lineage soon came to an end, the empire broke up, and social upheaval and natural calamities ensued. In other words, Bön created and until the present day has carefully nurtured a completely different narrative from that of Buddhism concerning the circumstances and the consequences of the introduction of Buddhism into Tibet. The doctrine and practices that were introduced into Tibet during the reign of Trisong Detsen went under the name Buddhism, but were not, so the Bonpos maintain, the true doctrine of Shakyamuni, but rather a perversion of it, and the results for Tibet were disastrous. In a standard work on chronology, a Tenzi, composed by the Burn scholar Nyima Tenzing, dated 1842, the author dispassionately lists the main events of Shakyamuni's life, from his birth at Lumbini to his entering into nirvana at the age of 80. A bit further on in the same text, however, Nyima Tenzing deplores the coming of Buddhist monks to Tibet during the reign of Trisong Detsen, an event which he describes as follows. So Shakyamuni is fine because he was an emanation of Trungpa Shenrab, but what came later in the form of Buddhist monks from India was a different story because their origin was not Shakyamuni, but the perversion of Shakyamuni's doctrine. So he says, the perverse prayer of a demon being the ultimate cause, and he who acted like a monk but retained the 5 poisons, that is Shantarakshita, providing the immediate cause of the appearing of the pernicious Buddhist monks, a demon having entered the heart of the king and the merit of the realm of Tibet being low, the time came when the sun of the doctrine, that is Burn, was made to set. I would argue that because of this radical difference between the historical narratives of Burn and Buddhism, one probably should regard these two traditions as two quite distinct religions, having incompatible views of history and of the source of religious authority and legitimation. In this sense, Burn and Buddhism are clearly not two sides of the same coin. On the other hand, Bonpos and Buddhists flawlessly share all the elements of Tibetan culture and traditional Tibetan way of life, and this extends beyond the fact that they're all Tsampa eaters and speak the same language and wear the same clothes. There is common ground in the sphere of religious life and practice as well, such as monasticism, religious art, meditational techniques, and scholastic philosophy. It is this shared religious and material culture, in combination, of course, with the extraordinary life of the late Menri Trizin, which is the main reason for the praise of the Menri Trizin by the Karmapa in September. Therefore, it could also be argued that in all essentials, Burn and Buddhism are, in fact, two sides of the same coin. Now, there is no doubt that there was considerable animosity towards the Bonpos within the Tibetan diaspora community in India during the first decades in exile following the exodus in 1959 and 1960. Nevertheless, there has been a gradual integration of the Bonpos into mainstream exile society over the last couple of decades. Thus, there has been official recognition of their integral part of Tibetan history and culture by the Dalai Lama, as well as what today is called the Central Tibetan Administration. One might therefore think that the two religious traditions of Tibet, Burn and Buddhism, might slowly move towards a greater degree of shared middle ground. One could bring to mind the words of David Snellgrove, one of the illustrious founders of modern Tibetology and for many years a professor here at SOAS, who said of Yungdrung Burn that, and I quote, "Accepting everything, refusing nothing through the centuries, it is the one all-embracing form of Tibetan religion." Now, I cannot claim to possess the gift of prophecy, however gratifying that would be, but I would say, however, that I am far from certain that Burn and Buddhism are destined to move ever closer together. I believe that the opposite may happen, and once again, the crucial issue is one of narrative. I say this because as I am speaking now, a new narrative of Burn is in the process of being created. This narrative is constructed around a crucial departure from the traditional Burn historical narrative and doctrine. Since its inception in the 10th and 11th century, the Yungdrung Burn tradition has maintained, as I've pointed out, that the homeland of Trungpa Shenrab was Womulungring, situated in our world, somewhere into the west of Tibet, but in our times inaccessible except to certain spiritually gifted individuals. In other words, as I said, a kind of Bonpo Shambhala. the narrative further maintains that Bern eventually reached the land called Shangshung, generally understood to be in present-day Western Tibet, in the region of Mount Kailasha, which you can see on the screen there, or as the Tibetans say, Gang Tise, and that the sacred scriptures of Bern, representing the word, the Ka, of Trungpa Shenrab, were translated into the language of Shangshung from the language of Wulmulungri. From Shangshung, Bern was in due course introduced into Tibet and already existed there when the first Tibetan emperor descended from heaven. So this is the Bern narrative, the traditional Bern narrative. In historical terms, there is little doubt that there did exist a polity of some kind called Shangshung, and that it was conquered by the Tibetans in the 7th century. Apparently, the Shangshung language was supplanted by Tibetan, which is why the Bonpos claim that the Shangshung originals of their sacred scriptures, with one single exception, are all lost. Nevertheless, up to the 19th century, Shangshung does not seem to play an important role in the Bern understanding of the history of their faith. Now, all this is now in the process of undergoing a profound change. Although more research is called for, much more, I suggest that today we are witnessing a process in which a new narrative is emerging that claims that Shangshung was an ancient and highly developed kingdom at the crossroads of Asian civilizations. A kingdom in which the Bern religion not only flourished, but in which the teacher of Bern, Trungpa Shenrab himself, had stayed and left visible traces of his activities, literally, as we shall see, on the ground. This new narrative, at least in its developed form, as far as it has developed up to now, I'm sure it will develop further, seems to have arisen in India some 50 or 55 years ago, when the Bonpos, soon after their arrival in India as refugees in the early 1960s, needed to assert their identity in a situation of cultural pressure and rapid and radical social change. This development has been studied by the Taiwanese anthropologist Yushan Liu, as well as others. A crucial element in this connection is, as we shall see, the conviction that Tibetan culture is indebted to Shangshung rather than to India. Tibetan culture in general is indebted to Shangshung rather than to India. The sacred texts of Bern play an important part in this narrative. As I've already mentioned, Bonpos claim that these texts were translated from the language of Shangshung into Tibetan. What is new is that in Tibet, as well as in the diaspora, numerous contemporary Tibetan scholars, mainly, but not only, Bonpos, make the further claim that a so-called Shangshung script was in use in Shangshung before the introduction of writing in Tibet itself, and, at least by implication, that this Shangshung script was the source of the Tibetan alphabet. The problem with this claim is that the Shangshung script, as far as can be established by paleographic and historical research, would seem to be an invention of recent centuries, based in fact on the standard Tibetan script, and not the other way around, which is irrefutably of Indian origin. Nevertheless, this is now regarded as more or less a received truth in many circles. In a recent article, the Oxford Tibetologist Robert Meyer has made a pertinent observation in this regard. He writes, I quote, "In the last 60 years, a modern form of Tibetan national identity has begun to be forged within the furnace of the Chinese occupation. There is now an ever-increasing demand for evidence of a great Tibetan culture entirely independent of China and India. A number of recent authors have turned to the Shangshung script. Here, they believe, is real evidence of an independent indigenous civilization." In short, what we are witnessing among Tibetans is a new and two-tiered development. a nascent cultural nationalism in which the Tibetan past is glorified and the Indian influence downplayed, and within this overall trend, the emergence in Burn of what could be called a new historical fundamentalism, by means of which Bonpo strive to give the religion the same kind of factual historical basis and prestigious status that the Buddhists claim for their own religion. In this connection, and over quite a short period of time, I would say a couple of decades, the existence of a Shangshung realm has become a firmly established article of faith in the minds of many Tibetans as well as persons in the West. Wikipedia features a long article, anonymous of course, in which the geographical extent of what is referred to as the Shangshung civilization is discussed as if one were dealing with a historical reality such as the Ottoman Empire or the European Union. Its language and history, as set forth in the article, are taken for granted, and its cultural influence, not only with regard to Tibet, but even India, is discussed as if we were dealing with established facts no longer in need of evidence. In the same Wikipedia article, it is also stated as a fact that a location called Chunglong Ngulkar, the Silver Castle of Garuda Valley, a site in western Tibet in Ngari that has assumed particular significance in present-day discourse on Burn, was, I quote, the capital of Shangshung. In recent years, there's been considerable focus on this particular site. Together with Chinese colleagues, the American archaeologist and anthropologist Mark Aldendorfer has conducted excavations at this and nearby sites since 1997. Although remains of various buildings have been explored by Aldendorfer, none can be conclusively identified as having served religious or ritual purposes. More significantly, not a single inscription has been found that cannot be understood as Buddhist. There are rock paintings, but they are difficult to date and cannot be recognized as evidence of a specific Shangshung realm unless the existence of such a polity is accepted a priori. The conclusion is inevitable: nothing whatsoever has come to light that can be linked to a Shangshung capital or culture or civilization, whether pre-Buddhist or otherwise. What in fact we are witnessing is the construction of an alternative national identity, mainly, though perhaps not exclusively, among adherents of Burn, an identity in which the role of India is downplayed and that of an imaginary Shangshung civilization takes center stage. As Yushan Liu writes, by stressing that Shangshung represents a historical and cultural heritage shared by Tibetans and adherents of the Burn religion in particular, and in seeking to preserve traditions inherent from Shangshung, Bonpo monastics are asserting the importance of Burn traditions in contributing to a distinctive Tibetan national identity. However, not only Tibetans and groups of Westerners have a stake in this new narrative. According to the Chinese State Council's webpage, an ambitious project was launched in July 2013, fully financed by the Chinese government, with the title Search for the Origin of the Ancient Shangshung Civilization. The immediate goal is stated to be to translate the entire textual corpus of the Burn Kanjur into Chinese, and this corpus is stated in the version they use to comprise 178 volumes. It's no exaggeration. I was involved in making a catalogue of another edition of the Burn Kanjur in 191 volumes, and I can promise you each volume was basically 500 folios. So this is no small undertaking. The project is located at the Social Development Research Center of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing, one of the most prestigious academic institutions in China. It involves a large number of bilingual monk scholars from Burn monasteries in China, the stated aim being to complete the entire project within 10 years. Short space of time. The reason given for organizing this entire project is worth pondering. The State Council website referred to above quotes a certain Bai Gengsheng, a professor of the Chinese Academy of Social Science, who is also the party secretary of the Secretariat of the Chinese Writers Association. Bai is quoted as stating that, and I quote, "The ownership of the ancient Shangshung civilization is ours. However, for a long time, authority for the interpretation and discourse of power were in the hands of foreigners." This project, end of quote. So this project will, it is further stated, study the language, astrology, medicine and philosophy of the Shangshung civilization, covering the fields of, I just quote, of Buddhism, philosophy, logic, literature, art, astrology, medicine, science, engineering, and so on. It will provide, I quote, an encyclopedia of Tibetan local cultural knowledge. The Shangshung cultural heritage still plays an indispensable role in the faith, production, and life of the Tibetan people. All this is on the website. It is also, I quote, "It is also the classic summary of the literature of indigenous religion in the Tibetan plateau, which was widely spread in the Tibetan plateau before the introduction of Indian Buddhism into Tibet. It is the most important spiritual belief of the Tibetan people." End of quote. No matter how this project is viewed, it is clear that the level of ambition is high. It is in keeping with the secular ideology of the Chinese state, however, that Burn is mentioned only as a component of Shangshung civilization, not as the main topic of research in its own right. The Burn Kanjur is in fact not referred to as such, but styled the ancient Shangshung Kanjur, a designation which is now used widely in China, implying that the texts it contains were composed in Shangshung, in the Shangshung language, and in the Shangshung realm, and that the Burn Kanjur maybe was even assembled there. The translation project, which I've presented here, is not a study of religion, but is regarded as a study of a civilization, the Shangshung civilization. In the meantime, and on another level, Shangshung, as a name, is being vigorously promoted as a brand name in the tourist industry in Tibet. It is used to market mineral water, for example, an entirely commercial venture, as well as inspiring the local authorities in Ngari in western Tibet to undertake to construct a Ngari museum, which certainly will not fail to feature Shangshung civilization. This project has already received a grant of 30 million RMB from the Tibet Autonomous Region government. Moreover, a Shangshung cultural tourist festival was organized for the 6th time in 2015, but I have no information of later events. It is clear that the current campaign for establishing a fictitious historicity of a Shangshung civilization has massive support from the central government in China and involves not only academics who work in the field of Tibetan studies in general, but, and crucially, high-ranking party members as well, who, it is not unreasonable to assume, have been assigned to oversee a project which aims at consolidating official control over Tibetan history and culture and expand this control in terms of space as well as time. Finally, the Chinese narrative claims that Shangshung is an ancient and rich civilization that is basically a part of the broader entity of China, and that through research and promotion, Shangshung should be reclaimed by China. The study of Bön, once again in the sense of Yungdrung Bön, is of importance, but only inasmuch as it provides material for the study of Shangshung civilization. This narrative, however, is confronted by a major difficulty, for Shangshung cannot, by any stretch of historical argumentation, if such argumentation is founded on viable historical sources, it cannot on any stretch of argumentation be understood as anything but a non-Tibetan entity. This is also the view of Tibetan Bonpos in exile, who have no interest at all in integrating Shangshung's civilization into the greater civilization of China. Under current conditions, it cannot be ascertained whether Tibetans inside Tibet share this view or not. There's also a second challenge to the Chinese Shangshung narrative. While the Chinese government may see a potential political advantage in reducing wherever possible the prestige of India as the holy land of Buddhism, the claim of India as being the source of Tibetan religion and an important element in its culture is still unquestioningly accepted by the great majority of Tibetans, who in this respect are on solid historical grounds. It therefore remains to be seen whether the new Shangshung narrative can become the basis of a sustainable Tibetan identity, whether in exile or in Tibet itself, or whether it will, in the long run, be seen as a means to consolidate China's control of Tibet and thus lose credibility not only within the global academic community, but also among Tibetans. I believe that Yungdrung Bön faces challenges in the long run. While it does, for the moment, provide a basis for an identity discourse for its adherents, it may face a struggle to maintain its claim to the historicity of its origins, as set forth in their historical narrative. However, the outcome is far from certain, for the history of religions offers many examples of vigorous religious movements based on narratives for which no viable historical proof is forthcoming, and in which proof of the authenticity of the doctrine is provided by texts validated by the narrative itself. So at that open question, I will leave it at that, and we shall see what may emerge over the next decades. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing that talk. So we'll take a couple of questions. Anyone? Yes.
One place you didn't mention was Tazik.
Yes.
So
Yes.
would you mind now just saying how does Tazik fit into this
Yes.
geography?
Well, yes. I mean, you do find in the oldest Yungdrung Bön texts, post 10th century, you find, I mean, Tazik is certainly found earlier as well, but in the context of Yungdrung Bön, you find Tazik mentioned right from the start. And it's not always very easy to see how Tazik is distinguished from Umulungring. But because it is often said to be the homeland of Tempa Shenrap, or the homeland of Bön. And then, of course, the question is if the word Tazik in Tibetan, which is given various etymologies, probably all of them pretty, constructed etymologies. For example, that it is Tak and Zik, like the two animals, tiger and leopard, or that it is Tak to Zikpa, because the people there, they can see so clearly because of the spiritual environment. But whether this word actually could link up with Tajik as a Central Asian location and ethnic group. Well, it's a kind of tempting thing to assume, but I don't think it can be taken for granted that it actually does reflect that. But it's a possibility. But it's also located, in the north and northwest in the Tibetan or Burman geographical schemes of the world. Beyond that, and it also continues, just like Womelungring, and I think confounded with it, as a kind of Bayul, as a hidden country or secret country, a holy land which you can travel to if a Dakini takes you there, and so on.
Connected with that, there's a Bombo scholar from Sharko in Southwestern National University, Chengdu, Kato. He argues that Taoistic and all the tradition is Zoroastrianism.
Well, yes, this is not actually so original. A number of scholars have found or claimed to find elements of Iranian religion in Yungdrung Bön, although curiously they have not been able to find anything which would remind them of Iranian religion among the ancient Bön priests, as far as I'm aware. You find this at least going back to Tucci and Helmut Hoffmann, and others too have. But I am. There may be certain cultural elements from Iran which you can find in general in Tibetan culture, but I would not say that it strikes me as very obvious that there is, a distinct and identifiable Iranian component in Bön. I think a lot of this, because in many Bön mythological texts about the creation of the world, the origin of the world, I should say rather, you have this idea of light and darkness and being and non-being and so on. And this, of course, immediately then one thinks of Zoroastrianism. But this kind of duality is found in a much wider religious sphere as well. You can also look to Chinese religion, to Taoism, with yin and yang and so on. I don't think one should make too much of these kind of similarities. If one can find solid linguistic evidence of loans of terms or then it's a different question. But I would not say that anything like that has come up yet. So I would call it for the moment. There may be possible in the future to find something, but for now I would call it speculation.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
With all due respect, the best piece of evidence I'm aware of for a connection between Bön and historically attested Western religion is in a paper by a certain Norwegian scholar that discusses a water miracle.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. but that's for it's a theme which you find also in Mithraism, and but it's actually this theme of this is an episode of Trungpa Shenrup who actually it's in connection with this his excursion into Konku to retrieve his horses. He also fires an arrow at a cliff with 9 shields or something, protecting the cliff. The arrow pierces all the shields, hits the cliff, and out gushes fresh water. This kind of thing but we find it also, in the Old Testament with Moses hitting the rock with a staff, and in many we have in Norway we have the patron saint of Norway, Saint Olav, traveled all over the country in the 11th century, and many places he would, when his forcibly converting people to Christianity, it was either Christianity or the sword, so to speak, and so when his followers were trudging through forests to the next valley to convert it and didn't have water, he would just put his spear into the ground and fountain would appear. And these are still there today, and these stories are still alive actually, Matthews. So it's a very widespread motif.
So according to the article you have just read, according to you, it looks like the narrative of Bön is in danger. Because it is loosely knitted without, much evidence, like Buddhism.
Yes.
Then I mean, it is the Bön system itself who is actually adopting the Buddhism. It looks like that because they themselves are saying that, you know, it is not Padmasambhava and you know, the king Tsering Dzin, but you know, Trungpa Shenrab, who actually showed the real Buddhism to Tibet.
Yes.
So it looks like, you know, the Bön religion is itself, you know, like getting itself into Buddhism. So do you think Bön will, you know, sustain its future, you know, in future, if it, you know, collides with Buddhism?
Yes.
Or will it, will it survive itself just calling up Bön?
That's exactly my sort of the question I ended with. But I think one needs to distinguish on the one hand between all those areas of religious life and practice where there is in reality an overlapping between Buddhism and Bön. And I think that has to do with the way Yungdrung Bön arose in the 10th and 11th century. It wasn't as a counter-Buddhist movement, but it was a movement which arose, you know, largely within a milieu which was heavily influenced by Buddhism already, but which was not prepared to accept that religious truth came from India. I think that was a crucial issue. But all these areas, you know, of you know, cosmology, of metaphysics, I mean, like Tsering, logic, medicine, meditation, all these rituals. Of course, many rituals are specific for Bön, but there are also rituals in other Tibetan traditions which are specific to them. So largely monastic discipline, all these things, they're not identical, but they're still very, very similar. So there's an overlap, and one could think that this could lead to a kind of merging. But if you look, and that's what I wanted to do, if you look at how these narratives which have been created to justify and give legitimacy and authority to one's own tradition, the way the Bonpos have done it has been by sort of turning the Buddhist story, you know, somehow to its opposite perspective, so that everything was fine before Buddhism arrived, and Buddhism arrived and everything, Tibet broke up, and you know, and Bön became almost like it was almost suppressed and so on. But what I think is that today, because the Tibetans, and this is not just for Bonpos, but Tibetans in general, they have to, like followers of all other religions, whether Christian or Muslim or Hindu or whatever, if they're going to survive as viable and dynamic intellectual and spiritual traditions, and not just as power structures, they're going to have to face simply the fact of critical historical research. And there I'm afraid that I'm not afraid that the Buddhists are doing well. I mean, they've got solid ground, and quite solid ground to stand on. The Bonpos have not. And it doesn't matter. That's why there's all this focus on Kyungno Ngari, because there it's like an archaeological site where you can dig in the ground and you can find remains of buildings. But then the problem is then you just say, oh yes, this proves that here we have the castle. Even the castle of Trungpa Shenrab, you know, is here. Mulkar, you know, it was right here. We can dig, we can prove, just like excavations in, I don't know, in Bodh Gaya or Rajgir or, you know, all over the place. It's a kind of effort to do something similar. And then there are different groups of people who have got different agendas. The Chinese have got their own agenda, obviously. The Bonpos have got an agenda, but they're all going to face this problem of critical research and a critical approach. And if they can't handle that, they're in trouble, I think, in the long run, frankly. When Kesang Nobu Gurung, who he's obviously of a Gurung background, but he's a Bonpo from Nepal, who was trained in Dolonji, in the monastery there. And then he was, you know, he got a scholarship and he went to Leiden in Holland, and had Henk Blazer as his supervisor, and he wrote a very good doctoral thesis. He got his PhD, and then he went back to the monastery, to sort of tell his fellow monks there what he had been doing. And I'm not sure that by that time he was a monk or not, but anyway, he went back to and he faced massive criticism, for undermining the religion by casting doubt on the life of Tampashan, because he basically said Tampashan, although he says it's not my issue whether it existed or not, I just show how the story was put together. But if the story of the person is put together from bits and pieces from here and there, it's difficult to maintain that it's a real person, or at least that it's a person we know anything real, solid about. So he was very heavily criticized by quite a number of the monks there, majority, but there were also some of the younger ones who said, this is good, we like this, because we have to do this, we have to be critical, we have to use, well, often, they say Western methods, but it's not Western specific, it's a kind of international, whether you are Japanese or Korean or whatever, you use basically the same research tools. Chinese also, they use the same. So, and they wouldn't like to be called Western. So, and some of the young monks, they understood we have to do this. So, you get this kind of debate, and this is going to be very interesting to see, in the long run, how they are able to handle it. The Buddhists can handle it more easily. I mean, they can say, okay, there are certain things in the history of the narratives of Buddha which maybe are not exactly historically correct because it's like mythical elements which have come from here and there. But the basis is true. The main points are true. He was born in a certain place, he lived a certain period, he went here, went there, and probably the most ancient Pali scriptures contain more or less the teachings which he actually gave. But the Bonpos have a problem. So, but they can also argue, I've heard the argument put forth that, okay, maybe Tampa Shenop didn't even exist, but that doesn't matter really in the end if what we teach can lead human beings to enlightenment. If the teaching itself can provide the means through meditation and philosophy and so on, never mind about the history. If it works, then that's the important thing. But this is not something which is now widely spoken, I would say. But we shall see what happens.
Okay,
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. My question is mainly about the language itself.
Yeah.
Buddhist language, particularly when we use mantra, we can sort of go to Indian route, Sanskrit or Pali.
Yes.
We go into that.
Yes.
When Bonpo recites Om Mati Muti Sali
Yes.
Napujami Shuddhu, where
does it come from?
come from?
Yes, yes. Well, I mean, the Bonpo texts are basically written in the classical texts, the ones you find are, on the whole, and the majority are written in what you would call just standard Chökei. Then there would be a few words which might be different, a few terms. For example, they don't use the word gelong for a fully ordained monk. They use the word drangsong, which translates Sanskrit rishi, for example. They use the word bön, where otherwise you would find chö, and so on. But you do not find, except for a few words here and there, you would not find many words which are even claimed to be of Shangshung origin. But as for the mantras, of course, the rule which was set down in the 9th century when the Buddhist texts were translated was that the text should be translated according to the meaning, but the mantras should be kept according to the phonology. So they kept the Sanskrit forms. So where do the bön mantras come from? Well, they seem to contain, some of them certainly must contain certain Sanskrit words, quite a lot of Tibetan words, and certain words which are claimed to be in Shangshung, and which may well be, from a kind of linguistic component of a language which could well have been spoken in Western Tibet earlier on, and which was supplanted by Tibetan. The same thing happened in Ladakh. I mean, there was a civilization there before it was conquered by the Tibetans, and the language was adopted as Tibetan. There are still remnants of probably an older language there, which is an Indo-Aryan language among some villages. So the same thing could have happened in Western Tibet, and you find many of these Bumpo words you can find, or which are claimed to be Shangshung words in the Burn tradition, you find in the dialects in Kinor, for example, quite a lot, I would say, the little I've looked into it. So it's not as if they're totally without any historical background either, but we don't know the circumstances of exactly how they were formed and so on.
Any more? So we are the fortunate ones to be here, be able to ask questions personally. But I'd really like to thank Professor Kværne for the stimulating talk. And unlike Buddha's time or Shakyamuni or even 200 years ago, your talk is recorded, Tsering there. So although we are a few here, but your lecture will be read on YouTube and Facebook and our own website, and it will stimulate further thinking, debate, and hopefully critical research into the area. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And as a token of our gratitude, the appreciation.
Oh.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
There's just copies of the newsletters.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah. This was
This for Kesang?
this
Yes.
for Kesang,
Okay.
this is for you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.